My wife's family mocked me at my father's funeral, until the will was read aloud. I still remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang that Tuesday morning. The kitchen tiles were cold under my bare feet, and I was halfway through making my second cup of coffee, the cheap instant kind, because that's all we could afford. My wife Sarah was upstairs, probably still sleeping, and I was enjoying those rare few minutes of silence before the chaos of another day began. When I saw my mother's number flash across the screen, my heart immediately sank. She never called this early. In fact, she rarely called at all anymore, not since I'd moved 3 states away to be closer to Sarah's family. The distance between us had grown over the years, and I carried the guilt of that like a stone in my chest. "Mom?" I answered, already knowing something was wrong. The silence on the other end lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then I heard her voice, cracked and broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Danny, it's your father. He's gone." The coffee mug slipped from my fingers. I watched it fall in slow motion, shattering against the kitchen floor, brown liquid spreading across the white tiles like a stain I'd never be able to clean. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do anything except stand there, frozen, as my mother's words echoed in my head. Gone. My father was gone. "What do you mean gone?" I heard myself ask, even though I knew exactly what she meant. "Mom, what happened?" Through her sobs, she managed to tell me the story. He'd had a heart attack in the middle of the night. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. He was 67 years old, and he'd spent his last moments alone in his workshop, probably tinkering with one of his countless projects, doing what he loved most in the world. I don't remember how I made it to the stairs. I don't remember climbing them or pushing open the bedroom door. But I remember Sarah's face when she saw me, annoyed at first, then confused, then something that might have been concern but didn't quite reach her eyes. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, sitting up in bed and pulling the covers around her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "My dad," I managed to say. "He died last night." For a moment, just a brief moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by a carefully neutral expression that I'd come to know all too well over our 8 years of marriage. "Oh," she said. "I'm sorry, Danny. That's terrible." She didn't get up to hug me. She didn't rush to my side or hold me while I processed the worst news of my life. She just sat there, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into her bedroom with an inconvenient problem. "I need to go home," I said. "The funeral. I need to be there for my mom." Sarah sighed heavily, and I watched her reach for her phone on the nightstand. "When?" "I don't know yet. A few days, probably. Mom said she'd call me back with the details." "Danny, you know my parents' anniversary party is this weekend, right?" She was already scrolling through something on her phone, not even looking at me. "We've been planning this for months. My mother will be devastated if we're not there." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Sarah, my father just died." "I know," and I said I'm sorry. She finally looked up, her expression impatient. "But your father and you weren't even that close anymore. You've seen him, what, twice in the last 3 years? Meanwhile, my family has been here for us through everything." The words hit me like physical blows. Yes, my relationship with my father had been complicated. Yes, the distance had created a gap between us that I'd always meant to close but never did. But he was still my father. He was still the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who stayed up late helping me with science projects, who worked 2 jobs to make sure I could go to college. And now he was gone, and I would never have the chance to close that gap. "I'm going," I said, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "You can come with me or you can stay here, but I'm going to my father's funeral." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Fine. But we're coming back for the anniversary party. I'm not disappointing my parents because of this. Because of this. Like my father's death was an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict, a minor obstacle in the smooth running of her social calendar." I turned and walked out of the bedroom without another word. If I'd stayed, I would have said something I couldn't take back. And despite everything, despite all the red flags I'd been ignoring for years, I wasn't ready to face the truth about my marriage. Not yet. We left 2 days later, after Sarah had made approximately 47 phone calls to her mother, her sisters, and various other family members to explain our situation. Each conversation was filled with heavy sighs and apologetic tones, as if attending my father's funeral was some great sacrifice she was making. Her brother Dave and his wife Jennifer decided to come along, ostensibly to support us, but really, I suspected, because Dave never missed an opportunity to make himself look good. He was the golden child of the Henderson family, successful investment banker, perfect wife, 2 perfect children, perfect everything. Standing next to him always made me feel like a before picture in one of those makeover shows. The drive was 12 hours, and I spent most of it in silence while Sarah, Dave, and Jennifer chatted in the back seat about things that seemed impossibly trivial. The stock market, their upcoming vacation to the Hamptons, the new restaurant that had opened downtown and had a 3-month waiting list. I gripped the steering wheel and focused on the road, trying to ignore the ache in my chest that had been there since my mother's phone call. My father's face kept floating through my mind, not the older version I'd seen in our infrequent video calls, but the younger one I remembered from childhood. The one with the full head of dark hair and the easy smile, the one who used to carry me on his shoulders and make me feel like I was on top of the world. "You know," Dave said from the back seat, his voice carrying that condescending tone he always used with me, "it's probably a good thing we're coming along. Help you deal with all the arrangements." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Nothing. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just that these things can be complicated. Estate issues, property, all that. You might need someone with a little more experience in financial matters." My father was a carpenter, Dave. He didn't have an estate. I saw Dave exchange a look with Jennifer, both of them smirking slightly. "Right, of course. I just meant, well, whatever he did have, you'll want to make sure it's handled properly." The implication was clear. My father was poor, I was poor, and Dave was offering his superior expertise to help us poor people navigate our poor people problems. It was the same attitude Sarah's entire family had always had toward me, and I'd never had the courage to call it out. The truth was, I'd come from humble beginnings. My father was a carpenter who ran his own small business, and my mother was a schoolteacher. We'd never had much money, but we'd had love, and for most of my childhood, that had been enough. I'd worked my way through college, graduated with honors, and then made the mistake of falling in love with Sarah Henderson at a company Christmas party. Sarah came from money. Old money, new money, all kinds of money. Her father ran a successful real estate development company, and her mother spent her days organizing charity events and looking down on people who shopped at regular grocery stores. When Sarah brought me home to meet them for the first time, I'd felt like a zoo animal being examined by curious spectators. But I'd loved her. Or at least, I'd thought I did. And when she said yes to my proposal, a proposal her parents had tried to talk her out of, I later learned, I'd thought we could make it work. I'd thought love would be enough to bridge the gap between our worlds. 8 years later, I was still waiting for that bridge to appear. "Danny, you missed the exit," Sarah said suddenly, looking up from her phone. I glanced at the GPS. "No, I didn't. We're not going to the hotel first. We're going straight to my mom's house." "What?" "No, we agreed. I agreed to bring you with me. I never agreed to put off seeing my mother so you could check into a hotel and freshen up." The words came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't apologize. "She needs me. She's been alone for 2 days while we took our time getting here." The silence in the car was deafening. Sarah's face had turned an angry shade of red, and I could see Dave and Jennifer exchanging more meaningful looks in the back seat. I didn't care. For the first time in years, I simply didn't care what any of them thought. My father was dead. My mother was grieving. And nothing else mattered. The house I grew up in looked smaller than I remembered. It was a modest 2-story colonial on a quiet street in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of house that real estate agents described as charming when they meant old and lacking updates. The white paint was peeling in places, and the porch railing my father had been meaning to fix for the past 5 years was still crooked. But it was home. It was the place where I'd taken my first steps, spoken my first words, dreamed my first dreams. It was the place where my father had taught me the value of hard work and my mother had taught me the importance of kindness. It was everything that mattered. I barely had the car in park before I was out and running up the walkway. The front door opened before I could reach it, and there was my mother, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were red from crying, her gray hair was uncombed, and she was wearing one of my father's old flannel shirts over her clothes. "Danny," she whispered, and then she was in my arms, sobbing against my chest. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here." I don't know how long we stood there on the porch, holding each other and crying. It might have been minutes or hours. All I knew was that I never wanted to let her go, never wanted to leave her alone again. The guilt of all those missed visits, all those phone calls I'd meant to make but didn't, all those chances to say "I love you" that I'd let slip away, it all came crashing down on me at once. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here," I said, my voice breaking. "I should have been here." "You're here now," my mother said, pulling back to look at my face. "That's all that matters." Behind me, I heard car doors closing and the sound of expensive heels clicking on the concrete. Sarah and her brother and sister-in-law were making their way up the walkway, and I saw my mother's expression shift slightly as she looked past me. "Mrs. Walker," Sarah said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "We're so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, dear." My mother's voice was polite but distant. She'd never been particularly close to Sarah or her family, and I'd always suspected she saw things in my wife that I refused to acknowledge. Dave stepped forward with his hand extended. "Mrs. Walker, Dave Henderson. We met at the wedding, though I'm sure you don't remember. Terrible circumstances, but we're here to help in any way we can." My mother shook his hand briefly, her eyes flicking to mine with a question in them. I gave a small shrug. What could I say? I'd married into this family, for better or worse. Come in, my mother said, stepping back to let us through the door. "I'll put on some coffee." The inside of the house was exactly as I remembered it, though perhaps a bit more cluttered than usual. My father's projects were everywhere, half-finished birdhouses, a rocking chair with one arm still detached, a beautiful wooden jewelry box that sat on the coffee table. I picked it up gently, running my fingers over the intricate carvings. "He was making that for our anniversary," my mother said quietly, coming to stand beside me. 43 years next month. "It's beautiful. Your father always made beautiful things." She took the box from my hands and held it to her chest. "That was his gift, you know. Seeing the beauty in ordinary things and bringing it out." Behind us, I heard Dave whisper something to Jennifer, and they both laughed softly. I turned to look at them, feeling my jaw clench. "Something funny?" Dave held up his hands again. No. Just admiring the decor." I followed his gaze around the room, seeing it through his eyes for the first time. The furniture was old and mismatched, the carpet was worn in places, and the wallpaper was at least 30 years out of date. To someone like Dave, someone who'd grown up surrounded by designer everything and professionally decorated rooms, this house probably looked like a thrift store nightmare. But to me, it looked like love. Every piece of furniture had a story, every scratch and stain was a memory. The armchair by the window was where my father read the newspaper every morning. The couch with the sagging cushions was where we'd watched countless football games together. The dining table with the wobbly leg was where we'd shared thousands of meals, conversations, arguments, and reconciliations. "We should get to the hotel," Sarah said, checking her phone. "It's getting late, and we all need to rest before tomorrow." I shook my head. "You go. I'm staying here tonight." "Danny, I'm staying here." I met her eyes, daring her to argue. My mother shouldn't be alone. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything else. She just gathered her things and headed for the door, with Dave and Jennifer trailing behind her. "We'll pick you up in the morning for the funeral," Dave called over his shoulder. "Try to get some rest." When they were gone, the house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My mother and I sat together on the old couch, not speaking, just being together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung from when I was 12 years old, and thought about all the ways I'd failed my father. When I was young, we'd been so close. He'd been my hero, my role model, my best friend. I'd spent countless hours in his workshop, watching him transform raw pieces of wood into beautiful furniture, learning the patience and precision that went into every cut, every joint, every finish. He'd always said that carpentry was more than just a job, it was an art form, a way of leaving your mark on the world long after you were gone. Anyone can build something, he used to say. But building something that lasts, something that matters, that takes heart. I'd planned to follow in his footsteps, to take over the family business and carry on his legacy. But then I'd gone to college, gotten a business degree, and discovered a world beyond the small town where I'd grown up. I'd met Sarah at that fateful Christmas party, fallen under the spell of her beauty and sophistication, and suddenly my father's workshop felt too small, too simple, too beneath me. I'd never said those words out loud, but I think he knew. I think he saw the way I pulled away, the way I made excuses not to visit, the way I chose Sarah's world over his. And he never said a word of reproach, never tried to guilt me into coming home, never made me feel bad for the choices I'd made. He just loved me, unconditionally and completely, even when I didn't deserve it. The tears came then, hot and silent, soaking into my pillow as I finally allowed myself to grieve. Not just for his death, but for all the lost years, all the wasted time, all the things I would never get to say. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs. The house was dark and quiet, but I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Couldn't sleep either? I asked, sliding into the chair across from her. She shook her head. The bed feels too big without him. 43 years of sleeping beside someone, and then suddenly they're just not there. I can't imagine. She reached across the table and took my hand. Danny, there's something I need to tell you about tomorrow. What is it? The lawyer is coming to the funeral. He said your father left very specific instructions about his will, and he wanted it read immediately after the service. I frowned. Will? Dad had a will. Apparently so. My mother's eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite read, sadness, certainly, but also something else. Wonder, maybe? Or disbelief. I didn't know about it either until the lawyer called. Your father, he kept things close to the chest sometimes. Especially near the end. Mom, what are you saying? Is there something you're not telling me? She squeezed my hand tighter. I honestly don't know, sweetheart. But I have a feeling we're all going to be surprised tomorrow. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her expression told me she'd said all she was going to say. So I just sat with her in the dark kitchen, holding her hand, watching the clock on the wall tick closer and closer to the moment I'd have to say goodbye to my father forever. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and overcast, which felt fitting. My father had always preferred rainy days, saying they were perfect for staying inside and working on projects. I imagined him up in heaven somewhere, requesting exactly this weather for his final day on Earth. Sarah and her family arrived at 9 sharp, dressed in designer black that probably cost more than my father's truck. Dave was wearing a watch that could have paid off my parents' mortgage, and Jennifer had pearls around her neck that gleamed expensively even in the dim light. My mother greeted them politely but didn't invite them in. We should go, she said. The service starts at 10. The church was already filling up when we arrived. I was amazed by how many people had come to pay their respects, neighbors, former customers, old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. They all had stories to share, memories of my father's kindness, gratitude for work he'd done for them decades ago. He built my daughter's crib, you know, an elderly woman told me, gripping my hands in hers. When we couldn't afford to buy one. Wouldn't take a penny for it either. Said it was his gift to a new life coming into the world. He fixed my porch after the storm last year, a man in overalls said. And when I tried to pay him, he told me to just pass it forward. Help someone else when they needed it. Story after story, person after person, each one painting a picture of a man I thought I knew but was realizing I'd only seen a small part of. My father had touched so many lives, helped so many people, made such a difference in this community, and I'd been so focused on my own life, my own problems, that I'd missed it all. Sarah stayed close to my side, her hand on my arm, playing the part of the supportive wife. But I caught the looks she and Dave exchanged whenever someone mentioned my father's generosity, his willingness to work for free, his lack of interest in accumulating wealth. "Such a sweet man," Jennifer said at one point, her voice dripping with condescension. So selfless. I knew what she really meant. So foolish. So naive. So stupid to give away his time and talent instead of capitalizing on it. The service itself was beautiful. The pastor spoke about my father's faith, his dedication to his family, his commitment to living a life of integrity. Several friends shared memories that made the congregation laugh and cry in equal measure. And when it was my turn to speak, I somehow found the words to express what my father had meant to me, even though I felt like a fraud standing up there. My father taught me that the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates, but what he leaves behind, I said, my voice cracking. Not just the physical things, the furniture, the homes, the projects, but the impact he has on the people around him. By that measure, my father was the richest man I've ever known. I meant every word. And as I said them, I couldn't help but notice the way Sarah's family shifted uncomfortably in their pew. After the service, we processed to the cemetery for the burial. It was a small plot at the edge of the grounds, beneath an old oak tree that my father had probably loved for its sturdy branches and deep roots. They lowered his coffin into the ground, and I felt a piece of my heart go with it. "Ashes to ashes," the pastor intoned. "Dust to dust." I threw the first handful of dirt onto the coffin, the sound of it hitting the wood echoing in my ears like a thunderclap. My mother was next, then various family members and friends. Sarah dropped her handful with a quick, efficient motion, like she was checking an item off a to-do list. And then it was over. My father was in the ground, and nothing would ever bring him back. After the burial, everyone gathered at my mother's house for the reception. The kitchen table was covered with casseroles and cakes brought by neighbors, and the living room was filled with people sharing memories and tears. I tried to be present, to appreciate all these people who had come to honor my father, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. Something was coming. I could feel it in the air like the electricity before a storm. Dave had positioned himself in a corner of the living room, holding court with anyone who would listen about his latest business deals and investment strategies. Jennifer was examining the furniture with barely concealed disdain, probably calculating how little everything was worth. And Sarah was glued to her phone, no doubt updating her social media followers about what a trying day she was having. "Danny." I turned to find a small, balding man in a brown suit standing behind me. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. "I'm Robert Greenwood," he said, extending his hand. "Your father's attorney." "Attorney?" I shook his hand, confused. My father had an attorney? For the past 5 years, yes. "We should talk privately, if you don't mind. There's the matter of the will." I glanced around the room, looking for my mother. She was surrounded by well-wishers, but she must have sensed my gaze because she looked up and gave me a small nod. She knew what this was about, even if I didn't. "Of course," I said. "We can use my father's study." The study was a small room at the back of the house, cluttered with books and papers and more of my father's projects. It smelled like sawdust and Old Spice, and being in there made me feel closer to him than I had all day. Mr. Greenwood closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. "Before we begin, I need to ask your wife and her family to join us. Your father's instructions were very specific about who should be present for the reading." "My wife's family?" I frowned. Why would my father want them here? "I can't say until everyone is assembled. But I assure you, there are good reasons." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in the attorney's expression told me to wait. So I went back to the living room and, with considerable reluctance, asked Sarah, Dave, and Jennifer to join us in the study. "What's this about?" Dave asked as he settled into one of the chairs, his tone suggesting he had far more important things to do. "My father's will," I said. "Apparently, he wanted you to be here for the reading." Dave and Jennifer exchanged amused glances. "How? Quaint, Jennifer murmured. Sarah said nothing, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. Despite her indifference to my father and everything he represented, she couldn't resist the prospect of knowing what was in that will. What could a simple carpenter possibly have to leave behind? My mother entered last, closing the door softly behind her. She took the seat beside me and squeezed my hand again, her expression unreadable. Now that everyone is here, Mr. Greenwood began, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick manila envelope. We can proceed with the reading of Thomas Walker's last will and testament. The room fell silent. Even Dave stopped his fidgeting and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Greenwood cleared his throat and began to read. I, Thomas Michael Walker, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The attorney's voice was dry and official, the words carrying the weight of finality. I sat rigid in my chair, my mother's hand still clasped in mine, waiting for whatever came next. To my beloved wife, Eleanor, I leave our family home and all its contents, along with my undying gratitude for 43 years of love, partnership, and patience with a stubborn old man who never could express himself properly. My mother let out a small sob, pressing a tissue to her eyes. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling tears prick at my own eyes. To my son, Daniel, I leave something far more valuable than money or property. I leave him the knowledge that he was always enough, exactly as he is. I leave him the hope that he will one day remember who he really is, before the world tried to convince him to be someone else. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My father's words, even from beyond the grave, saw right through me. He knew. He'd always known that I'd lost myself somewhere along the way, that I'd traded my authentic self for a version that I thought would make others happy. Dave shifted in his seat. That's it? Life lessons and sentiment. He turned to Jennifer with a smirk. I told you there wouldn't be anything substantial. Dave, Sarah hissed, but there was no real reproach in her voice. If anything, she looked relieved. Mr. Greenwood held up a hand. If I may continue. The room fell silent again, though I could feel the judgment radiating from Sarah's family. Poor old Thomas Walker, they were thinking. Too simple to accumulate any real wealth, too foolish to leave behind anything of value. Just a lifetime of carpentry and good deeds and nothing to show for it. Now, Mr. Greenwood continued, adjusting his glasses, we come to the matter of the estate's assets. Dave actually laughed out loud. Assets? What assets? A few hand tools and a beat-up workbench? Dave, please, I said through clenched teeth. Oh, come on, Danny. We all know what we're dealing with here. Your father was a good man, I'm sure, but let's not pretend he left behind some secret fortune. He was a carpenter in a small town. He probably died with more debts than savings. Jennifer nodded in agreement. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Danny. Not everyone is cut out for financial success. Some people are just simpler. I felt my mother stiffen beside me, and I knew she was biting her tongue to keep from saying something she'd regret. These people were guests in her home, at her husband's funeral, and they were mocking everything he'd stood for. Sarah, to her minimal credit, at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. But she didn't defend my father either. She just sat there, silent, complicit. Are you quite finished? Mr. Greenwood asked, his tone icy. Dave waved a dismissive hand. By all means, continue. I'm sure there's a lovely wooden spoon collection to divide up. Jennifer and Sarah both laughed at that soft, polite laughs that were somehow worse than Dave's open disdain. They thought they were better than my father, better than my mother, better than me. They thought their wealth and status and fancy degrees made them superior to a man who'd spent his life creating beautiful things and helping people in need. Mr. Greenwood reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. Very well. Let me read the asset summary, and then perhaps Mr. Henderson would like to revise his commentary. He cleared his throat again and began to read. Primary residence, paid in full, valued at $285,000. Life insurance policy, $500,000. Investment portfolio with Vanguard, $2,847,000. Commercial real estate holdings, 7 properties across 4 states, Total estimated value $12,500,000. Stake in Henderson Development Corporation, 15%, acquired over the past decade. Current market value approximately $8,200,000. Total estate value, $24,332,000. The silence that followed was absolute. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything except sit there, staring at Mr. Greenwood like he'd just announced that my father had been secretly living on the moon. $24 million. My father, Thomas Walker, small-town carpenter, the man who drove a 20-year-old truck and wore the same flannel shirts until they literally fell apart, had died worth $24 million. That's impossible, I finally managed to say. Mr. Greenwood smiled slightly. I assure you, it's quite possible and thoroughly documented. Your father was a remarkably shrewd investor, Mr. Walker. He started small, putting away a little bit every month, researching companies carefully before committing his money. Over time, those modest investments grew substantially. But he never said anything. I turned to my mother, who was crying softly but didn't look surprised. Mom, did you know about this? She shook her head. Not the full extent, no. I knew he had some investments, some savings he'd been building for years. But I never imagined. She trailed off, pressing the tissue to her eyes again. Dave was the first of Sarah's family to find his voice. Wait a minute. Wait just a minute. His face had gone from smug to pale in seconds. You said something about Henderson Development Corporation. That's my father's company. How the hell does Thomas Walker own part of my father's company? Mr. Greenwood consulted his documents. It appears Mr. Walker began purchasing shares approximately 12 years ago, shortly after the company went public. He continued to acquire shares steadily over the following decade, eventually amassing a 15% stake. 15%? Dave was on his feet now, his voice rising. That's the third largest individual stake in the company. How's that possible? We would have known if someone was buying that many shares. Mr. Walker was very careful to spread his purchases out over time and through various holding entities, the attorney explained calmly. He had no desire to draw attention to himself or his investments. He simply saw value in the company and acted accordingly. I watched Dave's face cycle through a range of emotions: shock, confusion, anger, and finally something that looked like fear. If my father had owned 15% of Henderson Development Corporation, that meant he'd had significant influence over the company's direction. That meant he'd been, in a very real sense, one of Dave's bosses. This is insane, Jennifer said, her voice shrill. This has to be some kind of mistake. I assure you, Mrs. Henderson, there is no mistake. I have worked closely with Mr. Walker for the past 5 years, helping him manage and grow his investments. Every document has been thoroughly verified. Sarah had gone completely silent. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disbelief and calculation. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she recalculated my worth, my value, my position in her hierarchy. But why? I asked, turning back to the attorney. Why did he never tell us? Why did he live like he had nothing when he could have? Your father believed strongly that money should be a tool, not a master, Mr. Greenwood said gently. He didn't want his wealth to change how people saw him or how he saw himself. He wanted to be loved for who he was, not what he had. And he wanted to ensure that when he was gone, his legacy would be about the lives he touched, not the dollars he accumulated. I thought about all the stories I'd heard at the funeral, the free work my father had done, the help he'd given to neighbors in need, the quiet generosity that had touched so many lives. He could have hired 100 employees and delegated all that work, but he'd chosen to do it himself, one project at a time, because that was who he was. He could have bought a mansion, but he'd stayed in our modest family home because that was where his memories lived. He could have announced his wealth to the world, but he'd kept it quiet because he understood something that Sarah's family never would, that true worth has nothing to do with net worth. There's more, Mr. Greenwood said, breaking into my thoughts. Regarding the distribution of the estate. The attorney pulled out yet another document, and I saw Sarah lean forward slightly, her earlier shock giving way to what I recognized as greed. She was already calculating, I realized. Already figuring out what this meant for her, for us, for her family's position. To my wife Eleanor, I leave the family home, the life insurance policy, and $2 million in liquid assets to ensure she can live comfortably for the rest of her days without worry or need. My mother nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "That fool," she whispered, but there was so much love in her voice that it sounded like an endearment. The remainder of the estate, Mr. Greenwood continued, including the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings, and the stake in Henderson Development Corporation, I leave to my son Daniel, with the following conditions. Conditions. Of course there were conditions. My father had never done anything without purpose. First, Daniel must resign from his current position at Henderson Development Corporation within 30 days of this reading. I blinked. I'd been working at my father-in-law's company for the past 6 years, in a mid-level management position that Sarah's father had grudgingly given me because he couldn't stand having a son-in-law who didn't contribute to the family empire. It wasn't a job I loved, it wasn't even a job I particularly liked, but it paid the bills and kept Sarah happy. Second, Daniel must spend a minimum of 6 months learning the craft of carpentry, either by studying with one of my former apprentices or by attending a vocational program of his choosing. I felt something stir in my chest, something that had been dormant for years. The memory of sawdust and wood shavings, of the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my own hands. My father wanted me to reconnect with who I used to be before I'd lost myself in the corporate world. Third, Daniel must use a portion of his inheritance to establish a scholarship fund for vocational students in our community, ensuring that future generations have the opportunity to learn trades and crafts that might otherwise be overlooked in favor of traditional academic paths. I was crying now, unable to stop the tears from falling. My father knew me better than I knew myself. Even from the grave, he was trying to guide me back to the person I was meant to be. And fourth, Mr. Greenwood said, looking directly at me, Daniel must decide, within the next year, whether his current marriage is based on love or obligation. If it is the former, he should fight for it with everything he has. If it is the latter, he should have the courage to pursue his own happiness, even if that means walking away from everything familiar. The room went absolutely still. Sarah's face had turned crimson. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Dave was sputtering. This is outrageous. You can't just put something like that in a legal document. I assure you, it's quite legal, Mr. Greenwood said calmly. Mr. Walker was very clear about his intentions. He wanted his son to have not just financial security, but emotional freedom as well. He wanted Daniel to know that whatever choice he makes, he has the resources to support it. But what about me? Sarah demanded, turning to me. What about us? You're my husband. I can't just what? I asked quietly. I can't just take time to figure out if I'm happy? I can't just consider whether our marriage is what I really want. How dare you? Her voice was low and dangerous. After everything my family has done for you. What has your family done for me, Sarah? I stood up, finally finding my voice. Given me a job I hate? Looked down on me at every holiday dinner? Made me feel like I was never good enough, never successful enough, never worthy of being a Henderson. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing but contempt. I turned to look at Dave and Jennifer, who were still staring at me with shock on their faces. All of you. From the moment I married Sarah, you've treated me like I was something scraped off the bottom of your designer shoes. You mocked my father on the day of his funeral. You laughed at his memory. And now you find out he was worth more than all of you combined, and suddenly you're outraged. Danny, Sarah started. No. I held up my hand. I'm not done. My father spent his whole life being underestimated by people like you. People who measure worth in dollars and status and appearance. But he knew something you'll never understand, that the true measure of a person is how they treat others, especially those who have nothing to offer in return. I looked around the room, at my mother, who was watching me with pride and tears in her eyes, at Mr. Greenwood, who had a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, at Sarah and her family, who looked like they'd been slapped. My father wasn't just rich, I said. He was wealthy in ways that money can't buy. He had love and purpose and the respect of everyone who knew him. And I spent years being ashamed of where I came from, trying to fit into a world that would never accept me, forgetting everything he taught me. I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside me. Something breaking loose and falling away, like chains I hadn't even known I was wearing. That ends now. The next few hours were chaos. Dave immediately called his father to warn him about the shares, about the fact that a dead carpenter had managed to accumulate enough ownership in Henderson Development Corporation to potentially influence company policy. I could hear the elder Mr. Henderson's voice through the phone, shouting with disbelief and fury. Sarah oscillated between trying to apologize and trying to manipulate. "Danny, sweetheart, I didn't mean any of what I said. You know how Dave is, I was just going along with him. I've always loved your father, always respected him." "You laughed when they mocked him," I said flatly. "You've complained about visiting him for years. You tried to convince me to skip his funeral for your parents' anniversary party." I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. "You were thinking perfectly clearly, Sarah. For the first time, I'm seeing who you really are." Jennifer, meanwhile, had locked herself in the bathroom and was apparently stress-eating the anti-anxiety medication she kept in her purse. I heard her crying through the door, though whether from shock or disappointment, I couldn't tell. Through it all, my mother sat quietly in the living room, surrounded by the casseroles and cakes that the neighbors had brought, looking more at peace than I'd seen her in days. "You knew," I said, sitting down beside her. "Not about the money, but about them. You knew what they were really like." She nodded slowly. "Your father and I both did. But we also knew that you needed to figure it out for yourself. You wouldn't have believed us if we'd told you. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because we loved you." She took my hand in both of hers. "Because we wanted you to be happy, even if your choices broke our hearts. And because we always hoped, that one day you'd find your way back to us." "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." "There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart. You're here now. That's all that matters." We sat together in silence for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of chaos from other parts of the house. Eventually, Mr. Greenwood came to find us. "I've explained the terms to the others," he said. "I don't think they're particularly happy about it, but the will is ironclad. Your father made sure of that. What happens now? That's up to you, Daniel. You have a year to make your decisions about the marriage. In the meantime, I can help you transition out of your position at Henderson Development and set up the scholarship fund. And I have contact information for several of your father's former apprentices who would be happy to teach you the craft, if you're interested." The craft. Carpentry. The thing I'd loved and then abandoned in pursuit of a life I thought I wanted. "I'm interested," I said. Mr. Greenwood smiled. "I thought you might be. Your father was very hopeful that you would remember where you came from. He knew me better than I knew myself. He was a remarkable man. I consider it a privilege to have worked with him." After the attorney left, I went outside for some fresh air. The sky had cleared while we were inside, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. I stood on the porch with the crooked railing that my father had never fixed, and looked out at the neighborhood where I'd grown up. Everything looked different now. Not because of the money, though $24 million certainly changed things, but because of what the money represented. My father had spent his whole life proving that success wasn't about accumulation. It was about impact. It was about the lives you touched and the legacy you left behind. He'd accumulated that fortune not through luck or inheritance, but through decades of hard work, careful planning, and quiet determination. He could have spent it on himself, could have lived in luxury, and shown the world what he was worth, but that wasn't who he was. He'd rather help a neighbor rebuild their porch than buy a yacht. He'd rather teach a young person to work with their hands than hire someone to do it for him. And in the end, that was the lesson he'd been trying to teach me all along. Sarah found me on the porch about an hour later. Her face was puffy from crying, her makeup smeared, her designer dress wrinkled. She looked more human than I'd seen her in years. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded to the space beside me on the porch swing. She sat down, leaving a careful distance between us. "I'm sorry," she said after a long moment of silence. "For everything. For how my family behaved. For how I behaved. For all of it. Are you sorry because you mean it, or sorry because you just found out I'm worth $24 million? She flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? 3 hours ago, you were laughing with your brother about my father's wooden spoon collection. Now you're out here apologizing. What changed, Sarah? Was it my father's death that finally made you see things clearly, or was it his bank account? She trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. I don't know how to answer that. That's the most honest thing you've said all day. We sat in silence, the porch swing creaking gently beneath us. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Children laughed. Life went on, indifferent to our personal dramas. I did love you, Sarah said finally. In the beginning. When we first met, when everything was new and exciting, I really did love you. What changed? She sighed. I don't know. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe I'm not good at loving people without conditions. My whole life, everything has been transactional. You succeed, you get rewarded. You fail, you get punished. Love was just another thing you earned or lost based on your performance. That's a lonely way to live. I know. She finally looked at me, and I was surprised to see genuine tears in her eyes. I know, Danny. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't love you the way you deserved. I'm sorry I let my family treat you like you were less than them. I'm sorry I was so busy trying to mold you into what I thought I wanted that I never stopped to appreciate who you actually were. Why are you telling me this now? Because your father was right. She laughed bitterly. In his will. He was right. Our marriage isn't based on love, not anymore, if it ever was. It's based on obligation and convenience, and the fact that divorce would be embarrassing for my family. I let her words sink in, feeling the weight of them settling around us like a heavy blanket. It was the truth I'd been avoiding for years, and hearing it spoken aloud was both devastating and liberating. So, what do we do now? I asked. I think you know. She stood up, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. I think we've both known for a long time. We were just too scared to admit it. Are you saying you want a divorce? I'm saying I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending. I'm tired, Danny. I'm tired of performing, tired of keeping up appearances, tired of being someone I don't even recognize anymore. She paused at the porch steps, looking back at me. Maybe you're not the only one who needs to figure out who you really are. She walked to her car without another word. Dave and Jennifer had apparently already left. I'd heard their car pulling away earlier, so Sarah was on her own. I watched her climb into the driver's seat, start the engine, and pull away from the curb. Just like that, 8 years of marriage reduced to a conversation on a porch and a pair of taillights disappearing down the street. I should have felt sad. I should have felt devastated, heartbroken, terrified of the future. But all I felt was relief, a profound, bone-deep sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. My father's voice echoed in my head. The true measure of a man isn't what he accumulates, but what he leaves behind. I finally understood what he meant. 6 months later, I stood in my father's workshop, running my hands over the workbench he'd used for 40 years. The surface was scarred and stained, marked by countless projects and thousands of hours of careful labor. It was the most beautiful piece of furniture I'd ever seen. A lot had changed since the funeral. I'd resigned from Henderson Development Corporation, as my father's will required, and discovered that I didn't miss it at all. The corporate politics, the endless meetings, the constant pressure to perform, none of it had ever made me happy. I just convinced myself that happiness wasn't the point. Sarah and I had filed for divorce within a month of the funeral. It was surprisingly amicable, all things considered. She didn't ask for any of my inheritance, partly because she knew she couldn't get it, given my father's careful legal preparations, and partly because I think she genuinely wanted to start fresh. The last I heard, she'd moved to New York and was taking art classes. Maybe she'd finally figure out who she was underneath all those layers of expectation and performance. I hoped so, for her sake. Dave and his father were less gracious about the whole situation. The revelation that a simple carpenter owned 15% of their company had sent shockwaves through their boardroom. There was talk of trying to buy me out, but I wasn't interested in selling, not yet anyway. I kind of enjoyed the idea of Dave having to report to the son-in-law he'd spent years looking down on. But most importantly, I'd spent the last 6 months learning carpentry. My father's old apprentice, a weathered man named Frank who'd worked with him for 20 years, had agreed to teach me. We started with the basics: how to measure twice and cut once, how to choose the right wood for the right project, how to see the finished piece hiding inside the raw material. Your dad always said you had the gift, Frank told me one day, watching me sand a piece of oak. Said you just needed to find your way back to it. I wish I'd listened to him sooner. Yeah, well, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. He was full of sayings like that, folksy wisdom that my father had probably taught him. I collected them like treasures, each one a small piece of my father's legacy that I could carry with me. The inheritance was being managed by a team of financial advisors that Mr. Greenwood had recommended. I'd use some of it to set up the scholarship fund my father had requested, the Thomas Walker Vocational Scholarship, providing full tuition to students pursuing trades and crafts. The first class of recipients would start next fall, and I was planning to attend the ceremony personally. I'd also kept all 7 of my father's commercial properties, which were mostly small strip malls and office buildings in working-class neighborhoods. The rents were reasonable, the maintenance was kept up, and the tenants were treated with respect. It was exactly how my father would have wanted it. But the money was never really the point. The point was the workshop, the wood, the craft. The point was creating something beautiful with my own hands, just like my father had taught me. Danny, my mother's voice called from the house. Lunch is ready. I set down my sandpaper and headed inside, pausing at the door to look back at the workshop. My father's tools hung on the wall, organized exactly as he'd left them. His unfinished projects sat on shelves, waiting to be completed. His presence filled every corner of the space. I was going to finish those projects. Every single one of them. And then I was going to start my own. Coming, Mom. I called back. Over lunch, my mother told me about her plans for the afternoon, a visit to the cemetery, then tea with some friends from church. She was doing better now, adjusting to life without my father, though she still wore his flannel shirts around the house and talked to his photograph every morning. Your father would be so proud of you, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You know that, right? I hope so. He is. I can feel it. She smiled, her eyes glistening. He always believed in you, Danny. Even when you didn't believe in yourself. I thought about everything that had happened since the funeral, the revelations, the divorce, the new beginning. I thought about the journey I'd taken from a man who'd lost himself to a man who was finally finding his way home. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my father was watching. Epilogue, 1 year later. The sun was setting over the cemetery, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I knelt beside my father's grave, running my fingers over the inscription on the headstone. Thomas Michael Walker. Beloved husband, father, and craftsman. Build something that matters. Hey, Dad, I said softly. It's been a year. Can you believe it? I settled into a more comfortable position, leaning against the oak tree that shaded his plot. It had become a weekly ritual, coming here to talk to him, to update him on everything that was happening, to ask for guidance when I needed it. I finished the jewelry box, I told him. The one you were making for Mom. Frank helped me get the hinges right. You were always better at that part than me. She cried when I gave it to her. Said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. A breeze rustled the leaves above me, and I could almost hear his voice. Good boy. I knew you could do it. I built my first piece from scratch last week. A rocking chair, just like the one you made for Grandma. It's not perfect. One of the arms is a little uneven, but Frank says that's how you learn. By making mistakes and fixing them. That's right. Every mistake is a lesson. Every failure is a chance to get better. The scholarship fund is doing well. 20 students in the first class, learning everything from carpentry to welding to automotive repair. You should see them, Dad. They're so eager to learn, so excited about working with their hands. They remind me of me, back before I forgot what was important. I paused, watching a bird land on a nearby branch and begin to sing. I met someone, I said finally. Her name is Emma. She's a teacher at the vocational school, one of the instructors for the scholarship program. She's nothing like Sarah, Dad. She doesn't care about money or status or what people think. She just cares about helping kids find their path. Does she make you happy? Yeah, she really does. I sat there for a while longer, watching the sun disappear below the horizon and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. It was peaceful here, quiet, a world away from the chaos and noise of everyday life. I understand now, I said eventually. What you were trying to teach me all those years. It was never about the money, it was about the choices. About deciding what kind of person you want to be, and then living that decision every day, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching. That's all I ever wanted you to understand. I wish I'd figured it out sooner. I wish I'd had more time with you. You had all the time you needed. You just weren't ready to see it. I stood up, brushing the grass off my jeans, and placed my hand on the headstone one last time. I love you, Dad. And I promise, I'm going to build something that matters. As I walked back to my car, I could have sworn I heard his voice on the wind. I know you will, son. I know you will. The drive home took me past all the familiar landmarks of my childhood, the elementary school where I'd scraped my knee on the playground, the diner where my father had taken me for milkshakes after Little League games, the hardware store where he'd bought his supplies and let me pick out a piece of candy from the jar by the register. Everything looked different now, but also the same. The town had grown and changed over the years, but its heart remained constant. It was a place where people looked out for each other, where hard work was respected, where a man was judged not by his bank account, but by his character. It was home. I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house, my house now too, since I'd moved back to help take care of her, and sat for a moment, looking at the crooked porch railing. Tomorrow, I was going to fix it. Finally, after all these years, I was going to finish what my father had started. But tonight, I was going to go inside, eat dinner with my mother, and tell her about my day. I was going to call Emma and make plans for the weekend. I was going to read a few pages of the woodworking book I was working through, learning techniques that my father had known by heart. I was going to live my life, not the life that Sarah's family had wanted for me, not the life I'd thought I was supposed to want, but the life my father had always known I was capable of. A life of purpose. A life of meaning. A life that mattered. As I climbed out of the car and headed for the front door, I thought about the day of the funeral, when Sarah's family had mocked my father and everything he stood for. They'd thought he was poor, simple, beneath them. They'd had no idea that he was worth more than all of them combined, not just financially, but in every way that truly counted. They'd learned the truth eventually, when the will was read. But by then, it was too late for them. They'd already shown who they really were. And so had I. I'd shown that I was my father's son. That I could be knocked down but not defeated. That I could lose my way but still find my way back. That I could build something that matters. The front door opened, and my mother appeared, smiling at me the way she always did. "There you are," she said. "Dinner's almost ready. Emma called. She's coming over tomorrow to help with the porch railing." She is. I think she just wanted an excuse to see you work with your hands." My mother winked at me. "Your father would approve." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. I think he would too. As I stepped inside, closing the door behind me on another chapter of my life, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. My father had left me a fortune, but his real gift was so much more valuable than money. He'd given me back myself. The end. Please make sure to subscribe. This story is dedicated to all the fathers who work with their hands, love without conditions, and teach their children what really matters, even when those children are too young or too foolish to listen. Your lessons aren't lost. They're just waiting to be remembered.